On the afternoon of September 14th, 1978, something unfolded inside a McDonald's restaurant in Alexandria, Virginia, that would expose a major Soviet intelligence operation running in the shadow of the nation's capital. The restaurant sat just off US Route 1, a busy commuter corridor linking Washington, D.C. to the sprawling suburbs of Northern Virginia, and it served a steady flow of government workers, military personnel, and contractors who passed through on a daily basis. The location was wedged between a gas station and a strip mall, but what was happening there, hidden in plain sight, was anything but ordinary. And it was uncovered not by sophisticated surveillance or federal agents, but by an employee who noticed something unusual. The employee was a 23-year-old woman named Patricia Martinez, and she had been working at the McDonald's for just over a year. Her responsibilities included taking orders, working the register, and periodically cleaning the dining area, wiping down tables, sweeping floors, and emptying trash bins. It was during one of these cleaning rounds, sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon, that something caught her attention. A man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit and glasses, had been sitting in a booth near the back of the dining area for approximately 20 minutes. He appeared to be alone, eating slowly and occasionally glancing at his watch, the kind of customer who seemed in no particular hurry to leave. Then, a second man walked in. He was younger, perhaps in his late 30s, with dark hair and a heavier build. He ordered food at the counter, took his meal to a booth on the opposite side of the dining area, and began eating. The two men never acknowledged each other. They didn't make eye contact, didn't gesture, didn't speak. To anyone watching casually, they were simply two strangers who happened to be having lunch in the same restaurant at the same time. But what happened next suggested something different. The younger man finished his meal, gathered the remains of his food into the brown paper McDonald's bag it had come in, and stood up. He walked toward the exit, and as he passed the trash bin near the door, he placed the bag carefully on top of the receptacle, not inside it, but on the flat surface above, and walked out without looking back. A few seconds later, the older man stood up from his booth, walked directly to the trash bin, picked up the bag, and left the restaurant. Patricia had been in the process of wiping down a table when the exchange occurred, and she paused, rag in hand, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. It was odd, certainly, but was it anything more than that? Perhaps the younger man had forgotten something in the bag, and the older man was a friend retrieving it for him. Perhaps they had come in together, and she simply hadn't noticed. She resumed her work, and by the end of her shift, the incident had faded into the background noise of the day. But 3 weeks later, it happened again. On October 5th, 1978, the same two men appeared at the McDonald's, and the sequence unfolded in exactly the same way. The older man arrived first, sometime around 2 in the afternoon, and took a seat in one of the booths along the far wall. He ordered food, ate slowly, and waited. 20 or so minutes later, the younger man walked in, ordered at the counter, sat down in a separate booth, and finished his meal. When he left, he placed his brown paper bag on top of the trash bin near the exit. Seconds later, the older man stood up, retrieved the bag, and walked out. This time, Patricia was certain it wasn't a coincidence. The timing was too precise, the movements too deliberate. The two men were executing a routine, and whatever they were doing, they were going to great lengths to avoid being seen together. She mentioned it to her brother that evening, a man named Michael Martinez, who worked as a security guard at a federal office building in Arlington, thinking that if anyone would take the observations seriously, it would be someone with a background in security. But Michael's reaction was dismissive, even mocking. The suggestion was made, half-jokingly, that perhaps Patricia had caught spies operating out of a McDonald's, which seemed absurd enough that the conversation moved on and the matter was left unresolved. Still, Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that what she had witnessed was intentional, that it meant something beyond the innocent explanations her brother had offered. She decided that if it happened again, she would watch more closely, and if necessary, figure out what to do next. The decision to take the observation seriously, to treat it as something worth investigating rather than dismissing it as coincidence or paranoia, would turn out to be the thread that unraveled an intelligence operation that had been running successfully in Northern Virginia since at least the spring of 1976, and possibly longer. On October 26th, the opportunity to observe more carefully presented itself. The older man arrived first, as before, settling into a booth near the back of the dining area. This time, Patricia had enlisted the help of a co-worker, a woman named Lisa Harmon, who had been working at the McDonald's for about 6 months, and who Patricia trusted enough to bring into what still seemed like a situation that might turn out to be nothing. The two women positioned themselves where they could see both the older man and the entrance, and they waited. 20 minutes later, the younger man walked in. He ordered food and took it to a booth on the opposite side of the restaurant and began eating. Patricia and Lisa watched without making their attention obvious, going about their usual tasks while keeping both men in their peripheral vision. When the younger man finished his meal, he wiped his hands on a napkin and began gathering the remains of his food into the brown paper bag. But then, just before folding the top of the bag closed, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out something small, too small and too quick for Patricia or Lisa to identify clearly from where they stood, and placed it inside the bag. He folded the bag, stood up, walked to the trash bin near the exit, and placed it on top. Then he left. A few seconds later, the older man stood up, walked to the trash bin, picked up the bag, and walked out of the restaurant. Patricia and Lisa looked at each other, and the unspoken question between them was clear. What was in that bag? The fact that the younger man had added something to it before leaving, something he had brought with him and kept in his jacket pocket, elevated the situation from merely odd to genuinely suspicious. Over the next 2 weeks, the two women discussed what they had seen and developed a plan. The next time the exchange occurred, Patricia would position herself near the trash bin, pretending to clean or restock supplies, and the moment the younger man placed the bag on top and walked out, she would grab it and dispose of it before the older man could retrieve it. Then, in the back of the restaurant, away from customers and any potential witnesses, they would open the bag and see what was inside. It was risky, and there was a chance the older man would confront her or cause a scene. But Patricia figured that if he did, she could simply play dumb and insist that she was just doing her job, that she hadn't realized the bag was anything other than trash left behind by a careless customer. On November 9th, 1978, the plan was executed. The older man arrived first, as always, and took his seat in a booth near the windows where he could observe the entrance. 20 minutes later, the younger man walked in, and Patricia immediately positioned herself near the trash bin with a rag and a spray bottle of cleaner, making a show of wiping down the area and straightening the napkin dispensers on a nearby counter. When the younger man finished his meal and walked toward the exit, bag in hand, Patricia moved slowly, deliberately, buying time and making sure her movements looked natural. The younger man placed the bag on top of the trash bin and walked out. Patricia waited exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the man to clear the doorway and step into the parking lot, then grabbed the bag, shoved it down into the trash receptacle, pulled the full garbage bag out of the bin, tied it off, and began walking toward the back of the restaurant. A voice came from behind her, calm but insistent. Patricia turned and saw the older man standing there, his expression neutral, but his eyes focused intently on the garbage bag she was carrying. He informed her that he believed she had just thrown away his food, that he had left it on top of the bin and had been coming back to retrieve it. Patricia kept her tone light and apologetic, explaining that she hadn't realized the bag belonged to anyone, that it was already in the trash now and mixed in with everything else, and that she could offer him a refund or let him reorder if he wanted. The older man's jaw tightened slightly, and he asked if she could simply open the bag so he could check. Patricia repeated that once something went into the trash, health code regulations prevented her from pulling it back out, that it was already contaminated by contact with other refuse, but that she would be happy to get him a refund or arrange for a replacement meal. There was a pause, a moment where the older man seemed to be weighing his options, calculating whether pushing the issue further would draw more attention than it was worth, and then he shook his head and informed her it wasn't necessary. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, his pace slightly quicker than it had been when he first stood up, and Patricia watched him leave before continuing toward the back of the building. In the storage area, away from the dining room and the counter, Patricia and Lisa locked the door behind them and opened the garbage bag. They pulled out napkins, plastic cups, greasy wrappers, and finally, the brown bag. Patricia opened it carefully, her hands shaking slightly, and reached inside. What she pulled out were two small photographs, each no larger than a few inches across, printed on what looked like standard photo paper. The images showed what appeared to be pages of typed documents, columns of data, technical diagrams, stamps, and markings visible in the corners that suggested official classification. The format was unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen government paperwork or military documentation. These were not personal photographs. These were images of classified materials, the kind of information that should not exist outside of a secure facility, let alone be hidden inside a fast food bag and pass between two men in a public restaurant. The decision was made immediately. This needed to be reported to the FBI, and it needed to be reported as soon as possible. Patricia and Lisa placed the photographs back in the bag, sealed it inside a larger plastic bag to preserve whatever evidence might be on it, and Patricia made the call to the FBI field office in Alexandria later that afternoon, once her shift had ended and she was away from the restaurant. The agent who took the call initially seemed skeptical. Stories about spy activity discovered by fast food employees were not typically the kind of leads that turned into serious investigations. But when Patricia described the photographs and offered to bring them to the field office, the tone of the conversation shifted. An appointment was arranged for the following morning, and Patricia and Lisa were instructed not to discuss what they had found with anyone else, not even with other employees at the restaurant. On November 10th, Patricia and Lisa arrived at the FBI field office and met with two agents who took their statements, examined the photographs, and asked detailed questions about the two men, the timing of the exchanges, and anything else Patricia or Lisa could remember. The photographs were logged into evidence and forwarded to FBI laboratory analysts and counterintelligence specialists at headquarters in Washington. The confirmation came back the next week. The documents in the photographs were genuine, and they appeared to originate from within the Department of Defense, specifically from materials related to satellite reconnaissance systems and technical specifications that were classified at levels requiring significant security clearance to access. What Patricia had stumbled upon wasn't petty theft or some misunderstanding. It was espionage, and it was active. By November 15th, 1978, a task force had been assembled to handle the case, led by Special Agent Richard Kellerman, a veteran counterintelligence officer with more than 15 years of experience tracking Soviet intelligence activities on American soil. Kellerman had worked cases in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, and he had seen enough dead drops, brush passes, and signal sites to recognize the hallmarks of professional tradecraft when he reviewed the details of what had occurred at the McDonald's. The assessment was straightforward. What Patricia had witnessed was a classic dead drop, a method of transferring information between an intelligence asset and a handler without requiring face-to-face contact or any direct communication that could be intercepted or observed. The beauty of the technique, from an operational standpoint, was its simplicity and its deniability. If executed correctly, it left no traceable connection between the two parties involved, and if one of them was caught or came under suspicion, the other could simply walk away and vanish without ever having been directly linked to the compromised individual. But this dead drop had been compromised. The bag had been intercepted, and now there was an opportunity to dismantle the operation and identify both the asset who was stealing the information and the handler who was receiving it. The plan developed by Kellerman and his team was to conduct surveillance at the McDonald's during the hours when the exchanges had previously occurred, which, based on Patricia's observations, appeared to be Thursday afternoons between approximately 2 and 3 o'clock. It was estimated that another meeting would take place within the next 2 to 3 weeks, assuming the network hadn't been spooked by the older man's failed attempt to retrieve the bag on November 9th. FBI agents would be positioned inside the restaurant, posing as customers, and additional agents would be stationed in vehicles outside, ready to establish mobile surveillance on both men the moment they left the premises. The goal was to observe the exchange, follow both individuals to determine where they went after leaving the McDonald's, and build enough evidence to support arrests and charges that would hold up in federal court. The surveillance operation began on November 16th, 1978, with agents rotating shifts to avoid any one face becoming too familiar to regular customers or staff. For the first week, nothing happened. The McDonald's saw its usual flow of customers, commuters stopping for lunch, families with children, teenagers gathering after school, but neither of the two men Patricia had described appeared. The second week passed the same way. By the start of the third, frustration had begun to surface among the task force. Some believed the operation had been compromised, that the older man's confrontation with Patricia had raised enough suspicion within the Soviet network to shut the site down. Kellerman, however, believed there was still a chance the network would try to re-establish contact, that the loss of one exchange wouldn't be enough to abandon a method that had worked for so long. On December 7th, 1978, Kellerman's instinct was partially vindicated. The younger man walked into the McDonald's just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the moment was immediately communicated to the FBI surveillance team via radio. But something was different this time, something that became apparent within the first few minutes of observation. The younger man looked nervous. He glanced around the dining area more frequently than Patricia had described in her previous accounts, his movements quick and tense, his eyes scanning the booths and tables as if he were searching for someone who wasn't there. He ordered his food at the counter, his voice audible to the undercover agent standing 2 people behind him in line, and he took a seat in a booth near the back of the restaurant. He began eating, but his attention was clearly divided, his gaze returning again and again to the entrance, watching each person who walked through the door. The older man never arrived. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. There was no sign of him. The younger man finished his meal, left his trash on the table, rather than taking it to the bin near the exit, and walked out of the restaurant. FBI agents waiting in unmarked vehicles outside immediately began mobile surveillance, following the younger man as he walked to a parking lot 3 blocks away, got into a late-model sedan, and drove toward the outskirts of Alexandria. The tale continued for another 20 minutes, with agents maintaining a careful distance to avoid detection, before the younger man eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small apartment complex in a residential neighborhood off Seminary Road. Agents noted the address, the license plate number of the vehicle, and the apartment building number where the man entered, and then they broke off the surveillance, unwilling to risk exposing their presence by following him inside or lingering too long in an area where an unfamiliar vehicle would stand out. Over the next 2 weeks, surveillance continued, both at the McDonald's and at the apartment complex where the younger man had gone. Background checks were run on the vehicle registration, which came back to a David Allen Becker, a 38-year-old technical analyst employed by a defense contractor called Systems Analysis Corporation, which held classified contracts with the Department of Defense. Further investigation revealed that Becker had security clearance that gave him access to sensitive materials related to satellite reconnaissance systems, communications protocols, and technical specifications for hardware used in intelligence-gathering operations. He had been working in that position for nearly 4 years, since early 1975, and his personnel file showed no red flags, no financial problems reported, no disciplinary issues, and no failed polygraph examinations. On paper, David Becker was exactly the kind of reliable, mid-level contractor that defense agencies depended on to keep classified programs running smoothly. But the evidence was beginning to suggest otherwise. The younger man appeared at the McDonald's one more time on December 21st, and once again he arrived alone, looked around nervously for several minutes, and then left without making contact with anyone. The older man, the individual who Patricia had seen pick up the bag on 3 separate occasions, never returned. It was becoming clear that something had disrupted the operation in a fundamental way, and Kellerman made the decision to move forward with an arrest before the trail went completely cold, or before Becker realized he was under investigation and attempted to flee or destroy evidence. On the morning of December 23, 1978, FBI agents executed a federal arrest warrant and a search warrant on David Becker's apartment at dawn. Becker was taken into custody as he left his apartment to go to work, and agents immediately began a systematic search of the premises. What they found confirmed the suspicions of the investigation. Inside a closet in the bedroom, hidden beneath a stack of blankets, was a 35mm camera and several rolls of undeveloped film. In a desk drawer, agents found handwritten notes containing technical specifications and data that corresponded to materials Becker would have had access to through his work at Systems Analysis Corporation. In the kitchen, taped to the inside of a cabinet above the refrigerator, was an envelope containing nearly $8,000 in cash, divided into bundles of $100 bills. Becker was transported to the FBI field office in Alexandria and placed in an interrogation room. For the first 3 hours, he said nothing, invoking his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. But as the morning turned into afternoon and the evidence was methodically presented to him, Becker's resolve began to weaken. After consulting with a public defender and being informed of the potential sentences he faced under espionage statutes, Becker agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What Becker told the FBI over the next several days was both a confirmation of the investigation's findings and a source of deep frustration for Kellerman and his team. Becker admitted that he had been photographing classified materials for about 2.5 years, beginning in the spring of 1976, using the camera found in his apartment to copy documents he accessed through his work. He explained that he had been recruited by a man he knew only as Victor, an individual who had approached him at a bar in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C., sometime in late March or early April of 1976. The approach had been gradual, professional, and carefully calibrated. Victor had struck up a conversation, bought Becker a drink, and over the course of several weeks had developed what seemed like a genuine friendship. They had met for drinks multiple times, always at different locations, always in public places, where their conversations would be drowned out by ambient noise and where surveillance would be difficult to establish. Eventually, Victor had made the pitch. He had told Becker that he worked for an organization that was interested in obtaining certain types of technical information that the United States government had classified, but that shouldn't be classified because it represented scientific knowledge that belonged to the world, not to any one nation. Victor had framed the request in ideological terms at first, appealing to Becker's sense of fairness and his frustration with government bureaucracy. But when that approach didn't gain immediate traction, Victor had shifted to a more practical argument. He had asked Becker about his financial situation, and Becker, who was at that time struggling with debt and medical bills from his wife's recent surgery, had admitted that money was tight. Victor had offered him a solution: provide copies of certain documents, nothing that would endanger lives or compromise military operations, just technical specifications and data that would help level the playing field between nations, and in return, Victor would pay him amounts that started at $500 per exchange and eventually grew to several thousand. Becker claimed that his motivation had been primarily financial, that he had been desperate, and that Victor had exploited that desperation. But the FBI's assessment was that Becker had known exactly what he was doing and had made a conscious choice to betray his country for money. The dead drop at the McDonald's had been Victor's design, implemented sometime in the late summer or early fall of 1976 after the initial exchanges had taken place, through other methods that Becker couldn't fully recall or claimed not to remember in detail. The system was simple and, as Victor had assured him, virtually foolproof. Becker would photograph the documents when he could, develop the film using chemicals and equipment that Victor had supplied, and then place the photographs inside his McDonald's bag during lunch. The entire exchange took less than a minute and required no verbal communication, no eye contact, and no direct interaction that could be observed or recorded by anyone watching. The system had functioned without incident for just over 2 years, through dozens of exchanges, until the afternoon of November 9th, 1978, when Patricia Martinez had grabbed the bag before Victor could reach it. Becker explained that he had waited in the parking lot that day, as he always did after making a drop, to see if Victor successfully retrieved the bag. When Victor had walked out of the McDonald's empty-handed, Becker had known something had gone wrong. He had followed the communication protocol Victor had established for emergencies, placing a specific mark on a utility pole, and he had waited for Victor's response. But Victor had never responded. When pressed for details about Victor, Becker's information proved frustratingly vague and, in some cases, deliberately misleading. He described a man in his mid-40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with brown hair that was beginning to gray at the temples, and a slight accent that Becker believed was Eastern European, possibly Russian or Polish or Czech. But beyond that physical description, Becker claimed to know almost nothing useful. No last name, no address, no phone number, no information about where Victor lived or worked, or what cover identity he used in his daily life. All communications between Becker and Victor had been handled through a signaling system that required no direct contact. When Becker had materials to pass, he would place a piece of red tape on a specific mailbox along Route 1, about 2 miles south of the McDonald's on any given Tuesday, and Victor would respond by leaving a chalk mark on a utility pole near the restaurant on a Wednesday, confirming that the exchange would occur the following afternoon. The FBI cross-referenced Becker's physical description of Victor with their database of known and suspected Soviet intelligence operatives working in the United States, and they generated a list of approximately 40 possible matches, but none of them could be definitively linked to the man Becker had described with enough certainty to justify arrests or further investigation. Kellerman's assessment was that Victor was likely operating under deep cover, using an alias and a carefully constructed legend that would withstand casual scrutiny and that was designed to leave no paper trail. The only realistic way to identify Victor, Kellerman concluded, was to set a trap using Becker as bait and hope that Victor's operational discipline would fail him. On January 9, 1979, with Becker's full cooperation and under FBI supervision, a piece of red tape was placed on the designated mailbox along Route 1, signaling to Victor that Becker had materials ready to pass. The FBI had prepared a set of false documents, convincing forgeries that resembled legitimate classified materials related to satellite reconnaissance, but that contained information that was either outdated or deliberately misleading and useless for intelligence purposes. The plan was for Becker to follow the usual routine exactly as he had done dozens of times before. Arrive at the McDonald's on the designated Thursday afternoon, order food, eat his meal, place the bag on top of the trash bin near the exit, and leave. FBI agents would be positioned throughout the restaurant and in vehicles outside, ready to move in the moment Victor retrieved the bag. Kellerman and his team arrived at the location early in the morning on Thursday and began setting up their positions. 2 agents posed as customers inside the dining area, one positioned near the front windows with a clear view of the entrance, and the other near the back booths where Victor typically sat. 3 additional agents were stationed in unmarked vehicles in the parking lot, and a surveillance van equipped with radio equipment was positioned across the street with a view of both the restaurant entrance and the Route 1 access points. Patricia Martinez and Lisa Harmon were both working that day, and they had been briefed by FBI agents to act as naturally as possible and to avoid doing anything that might alert Victor or any counter-surveillance operatives to the presence of law enforcement. David Becker arrived at the McDonald's just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly as planned. He ordered his food and sat down in a booth near the middle of the dining area. FBI agents watched as he finished his meal, gathered his trash into the brown paper bag, stood up, and walked to the trash bin near the exit. He placed the bag on top of the bin, exactly as he had done in previous exchanges, and walked out of the restaurant. The bag sat there, visible and untouched, for 1 minute, then 2, then 5. Kellerman, monitoring the operation from the surveillance van across the street, felt his pulse quicken as the minutes continued to tick by without any sign of Victor. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The bag remained on top of the trash bin, and no one approached it. Customers came and went, some of them glancing at the bag as they disposed of their own trash, but no one picked it up. At 20 minutes, Kellerman began to accept what was becoming increasingly obvious. Victor was not coming. The decision was made to have one of the undercover agents inside the restaurant retrieve the bag, and the operation was officially called off. Surveillance continued at the McDonald's for the next 3 weeks, with agents maintaining a presence during the hours when previous exchanges had occurred, but Victor never showed up. Agents also monitored the mailbox and the utility pole for any sign that Victor had attempted to re-establish contact with Becker through the signaling system, but there was nothing. No chalk marks, no indication that Victor was still in the area or still active. The FBI's investigation into Victor continued for several more years, with periodic reviews of the case file and attempts to match Becker's description with newly identified Soviet intelligence officers, but no significant leads ever materialized. Becker was interviewed multiple times over the years, including during debriefings conducted by CIA counterintelligence specialists who hoped he might remember additional details about Victor's appearance, speech patterns, or behavior that could be cross-referenced with other ongoing investigations. But Becker insisted repeatedly that he had told investigators everything he knew and that Victor had been careful to reveal as little as possible about his true identity or background. David Allen Becker was charged with multiple counts of espionage under Title 18 of the United States Code. And in March of 1979, after weeks of negotiations between his attorney and federal prosecutors, he pleaded guilty to unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign power. On April 12, 1979, Becker appeared before a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia for sentencing. During the hearing, Becker's attorney argued for leniency, claiming that Becker had been manipulated and coerced by a sophisticated foreign intelligence operative, that he had cooperated fully with investigators after his arrest, and that he had expressed genuine remorse for his actions. Federal prosecutors countered that Becker had been motivated primarily by greed, that he had been paid thousands of dollars over more than 2 years for betraying his country, and that his cooperation had ultimately failed to produce any actionable intelligence about Victor or the broader Soviet network operating in the Washington area. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing arguments from both sides, sentenced David Becker to 18 years in federal prison, noting that his actions had put American national security at risk and that the lenient sentence he might have received for cooperation was undermined by the fact that his cooperation had not led to any additional arrests. Becker would ultimately serve 11.5 years before being released on parole in November of 1990. The McDonald's in Alexandria remained open for roughly 20 years after 1978, but the operation itself, the dead drop that had functioned smoothly, was over. And it ended not because of sophisticated counterintelligence work or breakthrough surveillance technology, but because an observant employee noticed that a man kept leaving his trash on top of the bin and decided that it was worth a second look.